Hello, everyone. Welcome to Random Review. We're so happy you are here today. My name is Bonnie Brzozowski. I'm a public services librarian at the Corvallis-Benton County Public Library. And I am the co-coordinator for Random Review, along with my fellow librarian, Mike Hansen, who you often see as well if you attend these events. Today, we are here for a review by J. Renee Brooks of the book Finding the Mother Tree, Discovering the Wisdom of the Forest by Suzanne Simard. But before I introduce Renee, I just want to remind you of our upcoming random review on May 10th by Dwayne Plaza. Dwayne Plaza is going to review The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together by Heather C. McGee. Please note that this review is at a special time. So if you're a normal attendee, this is going to be a bit of a different time. We're going to meet at 1 p.m. that day. So May 10th, please join us for our special time at 1 p.m. rather than our usual noon. And we hope to see you there. That event will be held virtually. And please register at the link that I am going to share in the chat right now. Let me just get that queued up for us. Here we go. And there you go. You can also watch past random reviews from that webpage that I just shared, as well as register for our June random review as well. A reminder that the Random Review series is co-sponsored by the Friends of the Corvallis-Benton County Public Library. That's an all-volunteer organization committed to supporting the library. We're really grateful to the Friends for their tremendous support. You can learn more about the Friends and become a member at the link I will share in the chat here. But I have even more to tell you about them, so stay tuned. So the Friends are going to be holding their big book sale April 28th through April 30th in the Solar Building of the Benton County Fairgrounds, which is at 110 Southwest 53rd Street here in Corvallis. Please don't miss the special event. We're so excited about it. I'm going to share the link for more information about the book sale as well, if you just want info about that. So there that is. The thing is, the Friends really couldn't hold these book sales without support from volunteers like you. So please consider volunteering to help out at the April book sale. If you're interested in that, please email this email address that I'm going to also share in the chat and let folks know that you are happy to help them out at their amazing book sale. There's that email address there. It is folcorvallis.volunteer@gmail.com. If for any reason you cannot see the chat, hopefully that's helpful. Want to take just a really quick second to orient you to the platform we're using today, which is Zoom. I'm sure you're familiar at this point, but just a reminder that to submit questions throughout the presentation, which we absolutely welcome, we will answer most of those at the end. Please click on Q&A to submit a question. It's usually in the top left corner of the window, but it might vary depending on the device you're using. Just a note that we are going to send a video recording of today's review via email to everyone who registered approximately 24 to 48 hours after the event. Once the recording is subtitled by our staff, it will also be posted on our YouTube channel, and I will share the link to the library YouTube channel because you can see so much cool content, including all of our past random reviews and much, much more. So there's that there. Okay, now finally, let me take a minute to tell you more about Renee Brooks, our amazing and accomplished reviewer for today. So like the author, Dr. Suzanne Simard, Dr. Brooks obtained her undergraduate and graduate degrees in forestry schools around the same time as Dr. Simard. Her bachelor's degree was from the University of Georgia in forest hydrology, while her master's and PhD were from the University of Washington in tree physiology, focusing on foliage acclimating to the diverse light environments within tree canopies. Renee moved to Corvallis in 1999 and has worked with the EPA here as a federal research scientist studying tree physiological processes, such as hydraulic redistribution, which Suzanne Simard also refers to in her book. During the past decade, Renee's research has focused more on watershed hydrology and EPA's National Aquatic Resource Service, surveys. But she continues tree physiology research mostly through studying tree rings and the stable isotopes contained within them, another concept that Suzanne does touch on in her book. So Renee, I'm going to let you take it away. We're really excited to hear from you today. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me to talk about this. This is really quite a different type of thing for me. I'm used to talking about my own science and not somebody else's, but I really enjoyed reading this book, and it made me think a lot about my own pathway, because Suzanne and I had kind of had similar pathways and we were similar ages. So it helped me sort of refine my whole ideas about forests and the way that I think about them. I don't necessarily agree with Suzanne in everything she says, but we have a lot of commonality. So let's get this to advance. There we go. Is it advancing for you? No. There we go. Okay. So just a brief agenda. I'm going to go through a little bit of who I am, although we just had a brief introduction to myself. But why would I be the one to pick to do this review? Also then a brief summary of the book. And then because I'm a scientist, I'm going to focus a little bit more on some of the science. There is some controversy about some of the work in a recent paper that was published. So I'm going to kind of go into some of that and talk about also the science behind water movement and nutrient movement in plants. But I also want to touch on some of the broader pictures of Suzanne's path and within the forest industry, her work-life balance in academia, and overall her passion. And I think that one of the things you should take away from this book is that she has tremendous dedication and passion for the work that she does, and it really comes through. Okay, so who am I? Well, we were both born around the same age or same time. And I was born here in Oregon, in Salem, and she was born in British Columbia. And her family actually worked in forestry, so she was kind of brought up in forests. We both did our undergraduate degrees in forestry. I was at the University of Georgia, and she was at UBC. And then she came down here and did her master's and her PhD at Oregon State, right around the same times that I was up at the University of Washington doing my master's and PhD as well. We also had similar first jobs right after our undergraduate degrees, working for forest companies, doing seedling survival surveys. And this was a pivotal thing for her as she went out to one plantation and found the seedlings dying and was trying to understand what was going on, and pulled some up and noticed that they had dark roots and the roots were not thriving. Whereas she pulled up another seedling of a native species that was natural regeneration and saw mycorrhiza growing all around them. And so this was a fundamental thing for her. I did seedling survival surveys in the plantations of Georgia and South Georgia, very different scenario. But it was very interesting to me that this was a time period that we both had in common and be able to do that. Also, for most of our research, we've looked at the resources that plants drink. We're looking at nutrients, water, and carbon fluxes, and as they move around. Mostly I've focused on within tree movement of these, but I've also looked at below ground processes and linkages with some of the soil and soil properties. She's mostly looked at the mycorrhiza and the interaction between fungus and the trees and how they are working. So Suzanne, while we have those things in similarity, we really diverged sort of in where we were looking. As I said, I was above ground and she was below ground. I looked at leaves and how they adjusted their physiology to the particular light environment in which a leaf emerged into. So how they differ from the top of the canopy to the bottom of the canopy, and how they competed then for resources that are brought up through the common trunk. Whereas she was looking below ground and symbiosis between what the tree provided to the fungus and what the fungus provided to the tree. So let me just kind of give you a quick synopsis of part of the book anyway, in dealing with this common mycorrhizal networks. Suzanne's whole life was sort of focused around a lot of the inspiration that she got from starting as a child eating dirt. There's a very interesting section where she was doing that. And maybe some of that fungus got in there as well. That just really inspired her and kept her going with what was going on in forestry, as well as her family heritage. And I talked about as well her seedling and being able to see the seedling die. But the other part of that is that she also looked at the forest practices at that time in British Columbia and was deeply disturbed by the things she saw with the clear cutting and conversion of old growth into clear cuts and then plantations with usually monocultures. And this profoundly affected her and drove a lot of her research. And she wanted to really explore this idea of how these mycorrhiza and how the complexity of forest was a benefit to all of the forest, and that you couldn't just go forward with some of this plantation mentality in the British Columbia environment that she was doing. And her concept that she kind of comes to is that the large trees were essential for the smaller trees to be able to survive, and that the pathways through providing resources was through this mycorrhizal linkages. She decided to go and get her PhD after, or her master's and her PhD looking at this work. But her PhD work, which looked at carbon transport between two different species, now they were all seedlings and in the field, but she looked at between two different species, and she saw carbon going from one, or actually between the two of them, going back and forth. So she used two different types of tracers, carbon-14, which is radioactive carbon, and carbon-13, which is another tracer, a stable carbon, moving back and forth between them, and found them in the two trees. And she had one more tree that she had as a control, because it didn't share the same type of mycorrhiza between those two. So this work was published in Nature, and that brought her a lot of scrutiny. It was a highly controversial paper. And so she got a lot of feedback associated with that, and she kind of goes into a lot of that detail. The other part is that this book then takes her concept and really brings it forward into a popularized version that she's thinking about, in how forests, the large trees, which are called mother trees, and that they're then providing resources and caring for the young. As a scientist, there's a lot of that language that bothers me. And she talks about that, but I am a scientist, and yes, it bothers me. And so there are parts that we don't agree, but we'll go through that. So the general premise is that below ground, there is this common mycorrhizal network that is connecting all of the trees together. And through this common mycorrhizal network, trees are communicating. And that the large trees are providing support for the saplings and the seedlings. So this is the premise that she puts forward in the book. It's one she puts forward in a TED Talk. So if you don't want to read the whole book, or you haven't read the whole book, she has about an 18-minute TED Talk that kind of highlights on some of these that you can also go and see. So let's take a step back, assuming that you haven't read the book, and talk about what is mycorrhiza fungi. And just to start off, I'm not a mycologist, but they have been a known and important part of plants and plants' interaction with soil for a long time. They're a mutualistic fungus that pollinates onto the root system. So if you could look at this little picture, I think you can see my mouse. Is that correct? Can you tell me, Bonnie, if you can see my mouse?
Yes, I can.
Okay, perfect. Okay, great. So you can see the roots that are here within this picture of the seedling. Those are the long, thick ones here. There's like 3 of them that you can see fairly clearly. All of this other fibrous material, that's the mycorrhiza symbiont that is attached to those roots. And so one thing that you can see right away is that the roots, the mycorrhiza greatly expands the surface area exploitation of the soil that the tree is able to get by having that. It's much greater surface area than the roots by themselves. And so as a result of this, water and nutrients that come from the soil are able to be shuttled to the tree through the mycorrhiza network and up. And so it greatly expands the surface area contact with the soil. And it's been shown to be a great benefit to the trees, particularly in harvesting nutrients. Controversy comes about when you think about that this common mycorrhizal network is connecting all trees, and that there are resources being transferred between the trees, and that resource is then benefiting the other trees within the forest itself. So there's a recent paper that came out from Justine Karst. She's at the University of Alberta. And she is a mycologist as well. She studies below ground. And matter of fact, some of the co-authors of hers on this paper, you can see the citation at the bottom here. It's just published in Nature, Ecology and Evolution. She's providing problems that she sees associated with this particular idea, the concept of this common mycorrhizal network, and the claims that are being put out there in the popular science, not with Susan's published research, but with the popular science and the popular ideas that are put forward, some in this book, as well as in other locations. Part of it is that there is an over positive citation. So a paper might make one small statement and somebody else embellishes on that to be something that they really want to know. They want to see in the paper that this communication network is really there. And so there's a lot of that that's ending up happening. And she calls that out, as well as overinterpretation of the science that's already there. Studying below ground is exceedingly difficult. You can imagine that just, it's the soil as you stand on it, we can't see what's going on in there. I had it easier when I was accessing canopies because we can see that, we can get up there, we can move around into them, although access of tall canopies can be quite difficult in its own right. But below ground is very difficult. And some of the methods that we use, the experimental design, actually interfere with the functioning. So the things that we're doing, trying to isolate and control, actually cause other types of problems. So we need more research to be able to try and do that. And Suzanne's work has really refined and helped us be able to try and do that. But I also want to then go into a little bit more of how do water and nutrients move, and how much might flow through fungal. So again, just a little step back. For the most part, water and nutrients flow through trees and flow through the soil through passive processes, through gradients. So they go from high to low. There are points of active transport where across membranes where they go against the gradient. So for example, sugars up in the trees, in the leaves of the trees, are actively loaded into the phloem. The phloem is the pathway where sugars are moving within the tree. The xylem is where the water is moving through the tree. And those are two separate pathways in which resources flow within the trunk of the trees and through the branches and out into the leaves and down into the roots themselves. So for the most part, the active part of a tree is happening at the membrane, whether something goes in against a gradient or comes back out as a result of it. So through the membranes is active transport. The rest is passive. And all of those individual roots and the individual leaves are semi-independent of each other in the fluxes that happen there. And they're all driven, resources are moving to those individuals as a result of gradients. And it happens passively. Large trees have a massive amount of leaf area that has to be fed with water and nutrients, and the root system is supporting that. So when you compare the leaf area of a small seedling within the forest, it's much less compared to the needs of a large tree. Okay, so. And Bonnie, make sure if anyone has questions about some of these quick science things, you guys just put them in the chat. If I'm kind of saying things that you're not following with, it's fine. I've told Bonnie that she can just jump in at any point and just ask me questions, particularly for clarifying. I'm more used to talking to scientists, so if you have a question, put it in there. So one of the questions we're thinking about is that, okay, well, these hyphae are really, really thin and small. how much water can move or other things move along that in these gradients. And it depends on the resistance, which is going to depend on the radius, as well as the tortuosity of the pathway. And then the magnitude of that gradient from, if I think about mostly water and movement, so I think of wet to dry, the gradient, and the leaves are extremely dry, we're being able to pull up that water and release the water through their stomata. So water moves at the power of 4th to the radius. So for example, if you look at this, if you have a fungal radius of 1 and a root xylem vessel that's 5 times bigger, then the amount of water that can flow through that, the root vessel compared to the hyphae, is 625 times more. So it's to the power of 4th. That's a lot more water that can move in through the diameter. So think about that as you're thinking about how much water can move. Also know that, like, for water to make it from the base of a tree up to the top of an old growth tree takes 21 days. That's for the velocity of a molecule of water that starts at the base to get to the very top. So there's a lot of time for water to be able to try and move, and it takes some ability. So what are some of the points that Justine Karst made about this concept and the ideas put forth in the mother tree? First one was, how common are these mycorrhizal networks? Or do we see all the trees connected to the same mycorrhiza within the forest? And her answer to that was no, the data are very limited on that. There have been 5 locations within forests that have been measured throughout the world that have looked at mycorrhizal linkages, and one of those is Suzanne's that she has published and she talks about. But that the ways of being able trying to look at this through the DNA, while it might be able to show that there are some connections between those, there is also breakages, and that mycorrhiza is turning over quite rapidly. They're highly dynamic. And so that this idea of a continuous network is one that has not really been founded by her research. The second point that she makes is that, are these resources transferred through the mycorrhiza? Did they actually show that it is the mycorrhiza? And do they improve the performance of seedlings as a result of being able to be connected to that? And one of the things that she makes the point, and this is Justine who's making the point when she in her paper, is that the experiments, the mesh bags that they use to try and separate what's coming through roots versus what's coming through the mycorrhiza, in itself alter the environment, and they're confining the root systems of the seedlings. So the very manipulations that they're making to isolate and be able to control are also having profound effects on the seedlings and things that they've been testing these on. And so she says that if you look through the literature, you're going to find some cases where seedlings are increasing in their performance, some cases where they're neutral, and some cases where they have been profoundly negative. She also makes the point that whether or not it's flowing through the mycorrhizal network is also unclear, but it's very clear that what Suzanne found in her first paper, that there is some carbon that's moving back and forth. Trees shunt a lot of carbon below ground to support both their root system as well as the rhizosphere. So the rhizosphere is not only the mycorrhiza around the root, but also other microbes and other things surrounding that root system. And it's really important for the survival of the roots to be able to have that. My own experience is that when you look at underneath large trees, they're the ones that are drying the soil in the first place. So the large trees are taking up the majority of the water and creating the dry environment in the first place. And they're also shading those other trees. So it's complicated. There is some resources being transferred through mycorrhiza. Unclear whether or not that's adding a benefit compared to the negatives of being underneath large trees. Her last point that Justine is making in her paper is, do the trees communicate preferentially with the offspring. So Suzanne makes this point that the mother trees preferentially give to their kin. And what Justine is saying is that there is no published evidence of that. Now, I have not gone through the research, all of it. I read the book, absolutely, and I've read quite a bit of Suzanne's research as well. But Justine is the one who is publishing in this area and is much more familiar with this. So I'm going to take her word in saying that there is no published evidence of this. Instead, the area that I've done and worked in into the past is looking at hydraulic redistribution. So that is the process where, well, I'll go through these illustrations. So during the daytime, when transpiration is happening, so water is leaving through the leaves, this is to keep their stomata open to allow gas exchange. CO2 comes in, water has to go out. Same as why we have wet mouths, right? As we breathe out and breathe in, water is always lost from us. Water is lost from trees as they are exchanging gases with the atmosphere. And a lot of water. The majority of water that goes up in a tree just goes out the stomata, just to keep them open so that they can get CO2 in. But during the nighttime, the stomata close, and that gradient then disappears within the tree going up to the leaves. Instead, if you have a water gradient within the soil itself, as I'm showing in this figure, oh, there it is, where you have wet soil and dry soil, and it's connected by a root system, now you still have a water potential gradient, even though transpiration has stopped. So hydraulic redistribution is when the roots take up water from the wet soil and move it to the dry soil. And then they leak that water out. Again, remember that there can be an active preventing or allowing of water to move outside because it's crossing the membranes at that point in time. So there's an active leaking out that evidently has been a benefit for the trees because it wets the rhizosphere, and which is, again, the microbes and the fungus and all of the soil right surrounding that root. So this process, it's the research that I've done and with some colleagues as well, only happens with large trees that have roots that are connecting wet soil and dry soil when they get the gradient. It happens in the late summer when the upper soils, for us, the late summer, when the upper soils are very dry. They are very dry because those big trees and their roots removed that water and used it already. Evaporation, which is another process that could dry that surface soil, actually only goes fairly shallowly within the soil itself. So most of that drying is from the roots themselves that are happening. It's releasing, hydraulic redistribution is releasing small amounts of water that is happening. It's very small amounts of water. It does re-wet the rhizospheres we were talking about, but it does not wet the soil back up. It does not increase in water content because the next day the sun comes out and the trees pull that water right back up again. They can either take out that much or even more. But hydraulic redistribution does slow the drying. The benefit to a seedling is kind of minimal because partly it suffered from the fact of being dried by the big tree that's around them. But it does help keep that mycorrhiza network alive. It helps to stop the roots from dying, which they would do if it was really too dry. We had one experiment in which Justine actually mentions in her paper, that's the other Nature paper in 2003, where we were trying to see whether or not this hydraulic redistribution would go through the mycorrhizal network and into seedlings and surrounding them. So we did an experiment to try and do that. Now we pushed the system. What we ended up doing was cutting down, these weren't really huge trees, ponderosa pine trees, putting a reservoir of water on top of them that had deuterated water, which is labeled with a stable isotope of water. And we put dye into that water as well. And we essentially pushed water into the root system to allow it to redistribute. And we stopped transpirations, right? We've stopped the above ground stuff. So we maximized the amount of water these roots would be able to push out. And we did see transport through a mycorrhiza pathway because we used those mesh bags, and we were able to try and see that. So we saw that it happened, but it was a very, very small amount of water that got transported. And this was maximizing the possibility of hydraulic redistribution. So that's just something to keep in mind as you're thinking about, how much communication and how much seedlings might benefit, or how much the mother tree might care for those underneath it by providing resources. This is particularly with water, but that's the one that I have most experience. I do want to make the point, though, that the below ground is really mysterious, and there's a lot I don't think we know yet. It's certainly very active in cycling and biogeochemical processes. All nutrients, water, carbon, they are all moving along and in grounding gradients. But it's very dynamic, and it's highly complex, and it's really difficult to measure without disturbing the system that you're trying to do. Suzanne's research has been very pioneering and instrumental in a lot of our understanding of what's going on, as well as challenging people's conflict, their set ideas, and make them rethink about what's going on. In particular, I think one of the things she's done is she's challenged conventional forest practices and some of the things that they were doing, and just trying to get them to understand that there may be other ways that forests are interacting that we're not thinking about, when we've had, in the older times, more of an extraction philosophy when it came to taking wood from forests. But in this book, for my tastes, she pushes the concepts of this communication and forests caring for each other much beyond where I'm comfortable. And she's humanizing forests. And I can see that for popular culture, that this would be a good thing to do, maybe for them, to people to feel a connection with forests. But I don't see why we have to give them human things. Why do we want to make them seem like human? Anyway, she does use a lot of terms like calling the trees teenagers and children and mother trees and things like that, that definitely, they are amazing entities on their own right. And they don't have to be given human attributes in order to be able to be amazing, in my mind. So some of the research that I've done in thinking about it, if the complexity of them, this is the realm where I've been working mostly. You can see that this is the Wind River canopy crane and ways of accessing up into the upper canopies. And this is how we actually measured deuterated water, and how long it took to get up into the tops of these old growth trees was through the Wind River canopy crane. And then this is me as a master's student measuring respiration in foliage, accessing canopies. I have an interesting story about this. She talks a lot in her book about bears, and that when she was coming into her different studies and seeing bears and having to run away back into the truck. Well, I was lucky when the bears were coming by. I was up on these towers. They mostly didn't see me because it was a fairly dense forest, but black bears also not. This was up in Washington, so we had black bears, not grizzly bears. She had grizzly bears. I don't know what I would have said in grizzly bears, but she has some really good or good experiences where she describes those in the book about that. But the point I want to make here is that, just thinking about these trees and looking at how complex they are, and that this central system for distributing resources to all of these different points of foliage, all competing with this common trunk, for the water, for the nutrients, and then the carbon moving down and below ground, that this is a very complex system. And one of the experiments that we did with Doug Sprugel up at the University of Washington was to label branches and try and see, can we force an upper branch to give carbon to a lower branch? And the answer to that during most of the time was no, you cannot. We couldn't even get an upper branch to give carbon to another upper branch. So there's a lot of limitations to where that carbon is going to be. So, and branches die all the time. Parts of the trees die all the time. In fact, they're kind of unique in that part where you can think of them as sort of this reiterating structures where each root and shoot is somewhat semi-independent. And if other parts die, they can continue just fine. And it's one of the secrets to how trees are almost immortal. Certainly when you look at redwoods and Douglas fir, which she studies a lot, they can keep going and persisting by reiterating. They have hidden buds within the trunks in various locations that in the right circumstances, those will come out and make new branches, new things. Or if they're up against, if they're touching the soil, in the soil environment, they can form roots. And so if you have a trunk that comes up against a ledge of a rock that has soil on it, or even if you put soil on top of a branch, it can form roots into that area. So they have these ways of being able to construct construct the roots or construct the shoots that they need where they need them as they have lost others. And so they become somewhat immortal entities. And which also then makes me think of like, well, how much is that tree, as it's competing with all of its independent parts, going to shunt resources to take care of seedlings underneath it? It's not an entity that thinks about things like that. It's just passively transporting and continuing. They're amazing. They're amazing. But I don't have that same view that she gives these human concepts to trees. With that said, though, I was also struck by this book with amazing parts of just some of the challenges that I faced and she faced going through forestry schools and going into forest industry. And, you know, I think just in common, maybe of all people, but just of the struggles that you have sometime, particularly if you have an idea that is not well accepted by others. So she grew up, you know, she's a woman in a male-dominated industry, and not a lot of us were, but forestry in particular. And when I went to forestry school as an undergraduate at the University of Georgia, I was one of 4 women in a class of 35. So it was male-dominated for sure. But she grew up and learning, and her family all helps her out with the research. So she talks about, you know, the sustainable practices that they did in their forest management as when she was a young child. And then her first job was within the forest industry. And they had a policy which she calls free to grow. I actually was looking up free to grow when I was trying to do this. Free to grow is where they would eliminate all the other competition except for the species they wanted to have. So a monoculture, the same type of one. So if you put in Douglas fir, then any other competing species, particularly alder or birch or other types of hardwoods that they didn't want, were taken out, and was focusing on the cash crop. And it was written into the legislation that this was the way that you had to do it, you know, and, for land to be regenerated, if it was on public land, had to be regenerated in that way. At least that's how she describes it in the book. But when I was trying to find this on the internet, I'm not finding a lot. And instead, the Forest Service of Canada rebranded the name Free to Grow to actually mean free to bring women into the Canadian industry of forestry, and within that. So that was interesting. Free to grow meaning bringing in diversity now, rather than free to grow eliminating diversity within forests. So that's cool. The other thing I wanted to say is that one of the things I think Suzanne also pointed out, and a lot of people had known this because Janet Compton was doing research in alder forests, and there was a lot of stuff going on with the nitrogen fixing capacity. So other types of species do have other roles, and there's also niches that they can do. So it's not that they're always going to compete. And one of the things I think Suzanne brings up is that there can be cooperation as well as competition. Some of the things that I also really identified with were her talking about giving a seminar as a young graduate student to a group of foresters on her findings, particularly about, not having to get rid of alder or some of these other species in order to get establishment of the forests themselves. And some of the rude behavior that happened as a result of that, and not taking her seriously, talking over her, eating during her seminar, things like that, that I can also identify with, that happened. She eventually loses her position because she's really set on these ideas and that go against some of the forest practices that were happening there. And so she eventually leaves the forest, the Canadian Forest Service, and heads into academia. So she starts a position at UBC, and this really then comes into some places where she has struggling with several different aspects of her life. One is a dual career, and that her husband does not want to live in Vancouver. And so then she starts having to have dual households, and she's commuting. Her husband's not particularly happy with this. She commutes long distances, trying to do with the child career, raising children as well. And it ends up, ending her marriage. She establishes another remote relationship. She deals with cancer. So all of these challenges come along in her life, and she goes into a lot of those. But it's her strong passion and vision of science, of the science that carries her through. She turns to the science. So I wanted to kind of step back a little bit and talk about the traditional view of sort of what it is in STEM, in academic, in particular your research career, that you do just go in and you publish and you promote, and all these other aspects of your family life and other things are not part of that pathway. And it may have worked well when you had somebody stay at home and support a person to be able to go through and do all of these steps. But more and more, and this was in 2013, there's a lot of people who are not really happy with the work-life balance. And here's a survey that was done of males and females in academia and whether they were satisfied with work-life balance. And you can see that the females were not satisfied, more likely to not be satisfied with the work-life balance compared to their male colleagues. Although there is a range for both, there's always those that do and don't, do well. And this is a book by Hewlett in 2007, where she talked about off-ramps, and that, in this career trajectory, there are many, many, many pathways that minorities and women are much more likely to take. And it ends up that we have a male-dominated research community in forestry in particular, as a result of these conflicting things that end up in off-ramps. And we don't really have on-ramps. If you leave academia, if you stop publishing and going along, then you don't get to go much further. And coming back into it is very difficult. And as well, there's this glass ceiling that getting awards, getting promoted, getting recognized has been traditionally harder for women. It's getting much better now. But when I started graduate school, it was a 50-50 mix. And now at this point in my career, it's nowhere near that. So it happens. But Suzanne, she did manage to make it all the way through there and has excelled as a scientist, and really is now also outreaching and doing a lot of work to get word out there about different types of research, of her research. I may not always agree, but she's doing a great job in that. So just to kind of sum up, I think we're at a good time here. Thinking about advancing, I think Suzanne's work has advanced our understanding of forests. She certainly has looked at how complexity should be considered in silvicultural practices, and thinking about more adaptive and holistic forest practices that think about a lot of different functions associated with that, and bringing in diversity. And this has not just come from Suzanne. There's a lot of people that are working on that and are thinking about that and have been thinking about that. But her research, and she puts forward into this book, have certainly done that. Another aspect that thinking of this diversity and these types of things are going to help us in thinking about climate change and the impacts of climate change on forests and how we can make forests more resilient. I want to come back again and say that, you know, I admire the work that she has been doing. Below ground stuff is exceptionally difficult to try and do. And we really need people to pioneer and come up with new methods and being able to do that. But I think that we still have a lot to learn. We have different views of things, just maybe also from our perspectives and where we work, you know, and my looking at all these different branches and canopies and accessing all up and down, and her looking below ground at this nice symbiotic relationship. But we agree that complexity is very important to forest functions. And I'm really grateful that I had this opportunity to read the book and do this review. I don't know, I would have read the book probably anyway. But it helped me to think a lot about my own view of forests. I admire her bravery of being able to put her life out there in a book like that. I don't know if I would want to ever do that. And all of her struggles that she went through. And I also very much respect her science, and I applaud her efforts to really change things. So with that, I'll entertain any questions that you might have.
Great. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. We do have, let's see what we've got here. I'm not sure if you'll be able to speak to this or not, Renee, so just let us know if not. But so Lynn asked, regarding their updated management plan for the Rock Creek watershed, is the city of Corvallis coordinating with findings such as this and also your research? Same for the OSU College of Forestry with McDonald Forest and the Elliott State Forest.
There might be other people on this that could talk about that better than I could.
I wasn't sure how much familiarity.
I'm not, but you know, I would say in general, there is a lot more recognition of complexity, of species diversity, and things like that that are being incorporated, but I do not know the specifics of Rock Creek or of what OSU is doing right now. You know, being an EPA, I keep a little bit in there, but as I said, the last decade of my research has been focused a lot more on water and watersheds than it has been on forest industry and forest practices.
Sure, thank you, appreciate that. Cheryl asks, why did you go to UGA for forestry study when you were here in the Pacific Northwest?
Oh, I wasn't here at that time. My dad worked for the Federal Highway Administration. And so we were in Atlanta when I finished my high school, and then just went to the University of Georgia in Athens as an undergraduate. So yeah, I was born here in Oregon, but my dad worked for the Federal Highway, which is where we started in Salem, and then he traveled around in different locations, and so we ended up there. Gotcha. But cool. You know, yeah, I learned my love of forestry, I think, in forests here, camping up around in Cultus Lake, and you know, yes, certainly had that. And I always wanted to get back here, so eventually I did.
That's great. We're lucky to have you. Kenny asks, how would you design an experiment to test tree-to-tree communication? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, all of these ones that they have done over time, and there's been many, are, they've used different techniques. The problem is whether or not it's the mycorrhizal pathway. I mean, she did a technique where she labeled a tree and found it over here in this tree, but they do put a lot of carbon. But the problem, so there's no doubt that carbon moved from one tree to the other. But did it benefit this tree? And was, what was the pathway? There's also root grafting. I mean, if you dig along deep into the below ground area, you can find, particularly of similar species, they'll actually graft. And so there'll be physical contact between those. And then releasing to the soil and then taken up by the other tree is another one that they can just happen through the soil without the mycorrhiza. So there's a lot of different ways. And is the common mycorrhiza network the thing that's facilitating it? And that's the part that I think that Justine Karst was trying to point out, that the data is not there yet. And they're continuing to refine their techniques of being able to try and do it. But every time you dig below ground and you restrict roots of a particular individual from spreading, then you're creating other problems. So it's very difficult. So I'm not answering your question, but I would say that people are working and trying to get closer. And it wouldn't take just one experiment. I think it's going to take a lot.
Yeah, it does sound extremely complicated trying to gauge that kind of thing.
I think our hydraulic redistribution one worked, but we couldn't quantify how important that pathway is. Yes, we detected it in the seedlings. We pushed the system to the limit, but we couldn't say, did it make a difference to that tree or not, the seedlings? I mean, I think it keeps the mycorrhiza alive, which is really important to be able to hydraulically distribute and put water into the surface soil during the dry summer, but it doesn't water it. And she kind of implies that a couple of places in her paper, in the book, that it's adding water and that it's almost like irrigation, and that for me was a little too much.
Gotcha. Thank you. That's all the questions we've had so far. So I want to remind everyone, please submit your questions. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to submit a comment, that's fine too. I'm happy to share those. So please get in touch. In the meantime, I just want to say I did really appreciate your comments just about how women in particular, trying to get back into the field. I mean, that's definitely true of academia. It's true of a lot of fields, though, a lot of positions. It can be really hard to get back if you take kind of any amount of time off, or did you experience issues with that in your career?
So I did not have children, now there's that, so, and I think, did I want to stay on that publication pathway? Why didn't I have kids? A lot of different reasons, but, I think that anyone who does, it's really a struggle at that first part. If you take that, or you take care of an elderly parent, or other, things that come along, really brilliant brains, will disappear from our workforce without a good on-ramp to get them back into being productive. And that was what this book was about, that Hewlett book that I cited in there, we need to build these on-ramps. We need to be able to bring people back in if they take hiatuses. And this is true for male and females, just that females and minorities end up having to take those a lot more. It was a really interesting concept to me, and it resonated. As I said, I started 50-50 in graduate school, where there were half women, and I thought, oh yeah, so by the time I get up to later in my career, it's going to be 50-50, no problem. Well, that's not the case. They've disappeared, a lot of my women colleagues, and I don't know where they went. Well, I do. they had different things in competing. So yeah, it is still a problem. I think maybe it's getting better, but I don't know.
Yeah. Great. Well, I think that's all the questions that we have today. I want to say, as someone who didn't read the book, you really gave me a lot of great background and I was really able to follow everything. So thank you so much. I think you explained it all very well. And I'm really fascinated in what Suzanne is saying, but also in what you're saying. So I can't wait to explore this topic more, and I hope others feel the same way.
Great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I
Of
appreciate
course, thank you for your time. I know how much work this is. So thanks for spending the hour with us, and we hope to see you around town.
it. Okay, great. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for joining us.